Hello everyone, welcome back to your next section. Today we are going to go in depth on one specific data type. Well, two technically, but they're very similar to each other. We're going to learn more about integers and floats, as well as some operations that you can do with them. So we're going to learn about how to use these integers and numbers in Python, as well as I'm going to introduce to you some arithmetic operators. So these are a new set of symbols and operators that we use in Python to do math operations. 2 plus 2, 7 minus 3, that kind of stuff. And learning about math is really, and how to use math in Python is really important because a lot of logic is going to be based on comparing numbers or doing some sort of statistical analysis. I mean, especially with data science, you do have to know a lot about stats and to run statistical processes. So we have to understand how variables, specifically number variables, work in Python in order to do anything quite like that. So today, you're going to learn about the data types integers and floats. I'm going to give you the definitions for that. We are going to learn basic arithmetic operations in Python. So we're learning some arithmetic operators, and then I'm going to introduce to you a different arithmetic operator called the modulo that you might not be necessarily familiar with. So let's go into our definitions. First, you already know what an integer is from last class. An integer is just any real number, and it's like a number like 3, -7, 2,728,000. These are all integers because they don't have any decimal points next to them. A float data type is a number that has a decimal point. 3.2, 72.0. Everything with those points, 0.0001, it can go on for any amount of length. Those are called float numbers because they have what we call a floating point. That's what that decimal ends up being. So that is what a float type does. Now, we also have arithmetic operators. So what you're seeing on your slide here is the plus sign, the minus sign, the asterisk sign, and the forward slash sign. So the plus is obviously adding two numbers together. The minus is subtracting two numbers from each other. The asterisk is what we use to symbolize multiply. And the forward slash is our division symbol, okay? So you'll notice that it's obvious that with an integer or float, you can do math operations like 2 plus 2. However, you will not be able to do arithmetic operations on something like a string. How do you do hello plus tree? Or what is tree minus car? These aren't necessarily apparent. So the different data types have different functions and processes that you can use with them. And what you can use with integers and floats are number operations, math operations. And with strings, you can do, alphanumeric operations that you'll learn about next class. So, with that said, why don't we look at the syntax for doing math operations and see what we come up with. Okay everyone, so in this example we are going to go through a couple of different float and arithmetic operators. First, I'm going to remind you about how to assign a variable with an integer to a variable. So remember, the syntax for that is you first have to label the variable. You need to name what your box is going to be so that Python knows where to find it when you want to use it. Then you call the assignment operator here, which is a single equal sign. It's important not to use two equal signs because a double equal sign is a different kind of operator. So always one single equal sign is the assignment operator. And lastly, we then assign a value to that variable. In this case, it's an integer. The next example you see is how we format in syntax a floating number. So this variable knows that it's a float because there's this period here. Okay, so it says, oh, okay, so this is not an integer type because there's a decimal here, and it's assigned just like you would an integer. You label the variable, you name your box, you then tell Python, oh, okay, this variable doesn't exist yet, we want to change this variable if it does. We want to assign some value to it. So first float never existed. It creates the first float variable and adds 3.0 to it. Okay? That's really basically how it goes in terms of the syntax of a float and an integer. Just having that little decimal point there is all you need. If you wanted to convert an integer into a float, you could use the function in Python, float. You just write float like this. And then in parentheses, you put in the variable. Let's call that variable x. And it'll convert 5 to 5.0. So you don't even need to assign variables as floats. You can convert them on the fly. That said, in this case, we have assigned first integer to an integer called 5 and first float to a float valued at 3.0. So let's talk really quickly about arithmetic operators. Remember, those arithmetic operators are the plus sign, negative sign, asterisk. That's a bad asterisk, but you get the point, and our forward slash. So if we were to do, I'm just going to do fi and ff for now for labeling of these variables. So we can just do fi like that and ff here like that. So if we were to run this operation, fi asterisk ff, what would we get? What is 5 times 3? We should get 15, right? But the interesting thing in this is that you have an integer and a float type. These are two different data types. Can they interact? I'm going to tell you they can, but I'm not going to show you what the behavior is until we get into Python and code it, okay? But yes, you can do math operations with mixed integer and float types. It doesn't matter. It will basically just assume that it'll prioritize to a float. So it might do something like that. We'll show you though. In this example, we're doing an addition. So remember, our first float is 32. We can even do 32.0 here. And we would expect an answer of 35.0. Right? And that's really just how you do math in Python. It's really simple. What is this modulo number all about, though, or this modulo assignment? Remember, if you recall from division class, or like from division, if you were to do something like 5 divided by 2, what would you get? You would get 2 with a remainder of 1, right? So that's essentially what modulo is doing. It's going to try to divide your number by some sort of value. We're saying 2 here, and it will return, this is Python here with the 3 chevrons, it will return what is remaining from that operation, that arithmetic operation. So in this case, modulo 2 of our first integer 5 will return 1. If the first integer was, let's say, 6, this modulo will return as, what do we think? Yeah, it would return as 0, okay? So I don't want to go through what subtraction and division are. I'm assuming you guys can handle those operations. We did learn about modulo here. One last thing I want to show you in terms of math operations is, okay, what do we do with exponents? How do we call an exponent? Like 3 to the power of 2. How you do that is you go, in Python, it's 3 asterisk, asterisk, double asterisk, okay? 2. And that brings it up to an exponent. Last thing with all this, guys, is that Python does follow BEDMAS. So if you were to do, 3 plus 2 times 6, it will do the 2 times 6 first, and then add 3. So that's really important when you're doing your math. You have to make sure that your operations are on point. Okay, so now that we've dealt with some of the syntax of assigning integer and float variables, as well as learning about these 4 or 5, 6 different arithmetic operations, let's hop into Python and see how all this works. Everyone, now that we are back, we are in our terminal right now. Remember, you want to go to your little magnifying glass to the top right and put in terminal. You can also just save it as a shortcut on your toolbar. I would probably recommend that because you'll be using terminal quite a bit in your coding. So we are in bash right now, as you know, because we have this number sign. That is actually what the number sign is called. It's called a bash. We just call it number sign these days because it's associated with money. But you are in bash right now because you see that $sign. So if you were, let's say, logging into a virtual machine or a server somewhere else around the world, it's important to know what operating system that you need to communicate with. And if you log in, you say, oh, okay, I know this is bash. Anyway, we're going to enter into Python. We do that by just typing in Python, and we know we're in Python now because we have these 3 chevrons. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm going to, again, assign our integer. We're just going to go fi this time. And we're going to assign our first integer as the number 3. And then we're going to create our first float as 5.0. And let's see what happens here. Let's go type of ff. It indeed is a float. Okay, and if we do type of fi, it's going to say integer. Now, what happens when we try and do some math with this stuff? First, let's play with our integer. So first, let's do fi plus 3. Okay, so it has an integer, and when we added one integer to another, Python responded with the correct answer, 3 plus 3 equals 6, and returned it as an integer. Let's even check the type of the response. Indeed, it's returning as an integer as well. So Python is saying, this is their answer for this thing. Let's go fs really quickly and go hello, and see if we can do the same thing to our string. We can't. And what the error says is it's a type error, saying, oh, this is a string. In order to do this, you can't do this thing. It's a string, not an integer. Okay, so that's just proving that some operations can only be used on some data types. What happens when we now do our multiplication of a floating type with an integer? So this is unique in Python. Python dynamically types things sometimes. So essentially, if you were using another language, it might not work. But because Python knows, okay, well, I'm supposed to do an operation on these two things, one's an integer and one's a float. Technically, I can do that operation. I just need to treat this fi as a float as well. The reason why we don't treat the float like an integer is because what if this is 5.2? You would lose that 0.2, whereas just calling this 3.0 doesn't actually change anything with the integer value. So, with that said, you see there that it does dynamically change to a floating point, even though you're multiplying an integer by a float. Let's try that modulo now, see what happens here. Modulo 2. So when we do this, basically we're asking is the number an even number? And if it returns as 1, it means it's definitely not an even number. If it returns as 0, it means that there was no remainder, so it is an even number. What happens when we modulo an integer? So we have fi there, 3, we should get the same answer. So it knows that it should, because it was received a floating, an integer, it returned an integer. What happens when we do this? It does the same thing, okay? That should all make sense to you why you can mix these two types and why it's always returning as a float. Last thing I'm going to show you is how to do that exponent thing. So we have ff, let's do to the power of 2. So what's 5 to the power of 2? It's 25, okay? So there you have, let's do a division really quickly, 2. So fi is 3 and ff is 5. Let's do ff divided by 2 and see what happens. Okay, so it does know how to turn that into a float. It was already a float in the first place, but it does know that, okay, well, I have a float I'm trying to divide by half, so it gives the 0.5. Can I do the same with the integer? You can. So remember the integer was 3. Now, even though we both have two integers here, it knows that that remainder needs to be returned as a float. So in this case, this operation takes two integers and converts it to a float because of the operation requirements. Okay, guys, let's just finish up here. What did you guys learn today? First, you learned how to do basic arithmetic in Python. You learned how to do addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. You also learned about the modulo operator, as well as how to do exponents, which is a double asterisk. You learned about basic operations with floats and variables, where we're looking at types and we're doing addition and subtraction. And then you looked at a couple of other functions there. So next class, we're going to focus on strings and do a very similar process where I teach you the syntax of a string and then some little tricks you can do with operators with strings. Catch you in that one.